very much for your interest in the Google Data APIs. I'd like to welcome both those of you who are watching in the webcast or on video later on or here live. I hope you also got a chance to see the other earlier talk from the introduction for the Google Data APIs by Jeff. And I'll be covering a lot of the same materials. I wanted to get a little bit deeper into some of the protocol details of Google Data APIs and maybe answer a lot of the more difficult parts that developers have encountered when they tried to use Google Data APIs. So I'll talk again about Google Data APIs. Even though this is an advanced talk, you're not required to know GData ahead of time. So I'll go a lot about what GData is and what technologies are already there. I'll give you a very simple example of adding a calendar event and editing it afterwards and deleting it. And then I'll go into the JavaScript object notation. It's a relatively new thing that we have to support JavaScript developers. We also have, and I'll go into authentication and maybe a little bit more details about the client login and auth-sub, and explain the difference between two and when you should use which one. So just to understand what GData is, Google has a lot of APIs. We have a variety of different approaches to doing APIs for different Google services. And Google Data API is really a way of standardizing how we do data-oriented APIs. So you'll see Google Calendar is a very popular data API. The Google the Blogger Data API is very popular. We got a lot of new ones. We've got Google Base as one of our original data APIs, but we got a lot of new ones. Also, the Google Apps for your domain has an API. Google Notebook Data API, the Picasa web albums, you can manage photos. The Google Spreadsheets is also a very useful one. And that list is growing. You'll see announcements coming out for GData APIs that are going to come out. And over time, you're going to see more and more of these data APIs. We're not going to cover every single functionality that you're going to see through the UI, but we're going to definitely try to bring those and design those right as much as possible. Google is absolutely committed to those APIs. So when I say GData, I really mean Google Data API, just a shorthand for that. GData is about a protocol for reading and writing structured data. It's not the HTML pages that you get when you log in on your browser. This is the XML data or the JavaScript object notation or its RSS. Whatever format it's in, we're able to expose that data. So it's based on the REST style of APIs. The idea being that every feed is made up of entries, and each of these entries has a unique identifier. So they represent an XML document, which you can do CRUD operations on. You can create new entries, you can retrieve them, you can update them, you can delete them. It's a lot less complicated than some of the SOAP based services you'll see out there, which limits what we can do, but you'll see maybe 90% of everything you can imagine to do with Google services you can oftentimes accomplish with GData. And that's why we chose it. We think developers like it. We think it makes it a lot more likely to be adopted, and that's why we went with this approach. And another strong reason why we went with the way we designed GData is we want to make sure to take advantage of open standards as much as possible when they're available. So I mentioned RSS. A lot of people know it's a well-known syndication format for reading data. There's also Atom is out there. It's newer, and it's got a little bit more features than RSS, and we support both. And the Atom syndication format is particularly interesting because it's often associated with the Atom publishing protocol. And that's an emerging standard, and you'll see a lot of services out there that are based on the Atom publishing protocol being built right now. And they follow, and then they basically design how to do REST-style APIs. And use HTTP GET to retrieve data. You use HTTP POST to add new entries to the feed. You use HTTP PUT to update entries. You use HTTP delete to delete entries. And that's kind of the fundamental idea. And everything is kind of based on that idea. We are actively involved with the Atom Publishing Protocol group, the GData at Google in general. And finally, I wanted to mention the JavaScript object notation, which I'll give a very, very simple example of later on. It's another way of formatting that data. It's really essentially what it is, and it's ideally suited for doing it in JavaScript. So we are based in the open standards, and over time, we're going to contribute more and more of some of the things that we've done with GData into those standards. But for now, for us to be able to move fast, we've developed Google technologies that made a lot of sense for our needs. So authentication is sort of the #1 thing you'll see that you'll encounter anytime you build any kind of authenticated web service. So client login is the one that we encourage to use for installed applications. You install something on your computer, you expect a certain level of trust. So probably it's OK for the user to give them their username and password for accessing Google services. So the application acts on the user's behalf and is able to grab their Google Calendar events. It's able to grab their blogs. It's able to do a lot of things. It can do a lot of creative things with that data. And that's a level of trust that you give an install application. It's not a level of trust that you expect users to give to web-based applications. So you're going to see these web applications redirecting you to google.com, where you will sign in as a user, and then you explicitly give permission to that website to access a specific amount of data. So it's going to encourage a lot more users for web applications if the users don't have to give their username and passwords. And you'll see websites out there that are asking for the user's Gmail username and password, and we hope to discourage that over time and move them towards using us. Batch processing, another one that was particularly important for Google Base, which allows you to upload a whole bunch of data all at once, so you're not entering one entry at a time. So it minimizes the amount of HTTP traffic. It's a little bit more efficient, and it allows you also to do multiple reads, and you'll see a lot of batch processing as an example of something we've added on top of the open standards. Optimistic concurrency is something that Jeff talked about earlier today. He gave an example where he had an entry that was updated, and then suppose another application wanted to come in and update that same entry. If that application was editing the old version, that entry will give a 409 conflict error. So it's a kind of a very simplistic way of making sure that application is always working with the latest version of the data. So we provide a lot of developer support. We encourage a lot of client libraries to be developed in a lot of programming languages. Since we've published all the information you need to know that the server publishes, there's no reason why you couldn't write a client library in your programming language. And we provide some of those for some of the most popular programming languages for Java, for .NET, for Python, Objective-C. We have a lot of contributions from other companies for our other client libraries, PHP, Ruby, Perl, Lisp. I mentioned we do provide JavaScript object notation as a sort of a simpler way of working with JavaScript. It's not an actual client library. So documentation, we have go to code.google.com, not surprisingly, /API/GData, and you'll see everything that's in this talk. You'll see on that website in a lot more detail than I can provide you in 45 minutes. We have a great knowledge base there, a lot of problems that developers have encountered. You can find out. There's a Google Data API group there that's that we actively look at, and we're seeing the feedback that we get, and we very much appreciate it. Helps us prioritize what we do and what features we provide to the developer community. So I'll go a little bit more into GData API specification. Suppose you are writing a client, and and maybe even you're writing your own client library, but suppose you're using a client and you want to access as much data as possible out of a Google service. You want to get as much usage of it as possible. You want to understand what are the URLs that Google service provides, and you want to know that from the point of view of the URL for the feed, the URL for getting individual entries. You want to know what parameters it accepts, what query parameters, and you want to know what HTTP verbs it supports. And finally, you want to know what are the XML elements that it uses. A lot of times it uses standard ones, but sometimes there are a lot of server-specific XML elements you'll find. So here's an example of the calendar URLs, and it has a lot more than a lot of people expected. The base URL is always google.com/calendar/feeds. You'll see that pattern in most of our GData feeds. And there's a feed of calendars that the user owns. And that's just / and then the user ID, like somebody at gmail.com. And then you can get a specific calendar by attaching an ID at the end. And with the calendars feed, only get is supported. I mentioned that not all verbs are always supported. And then there's a calendar events feed, and you just attach a visibility and a projection. So what is that about? You got a visibility of all the public calendar events, and you got these events that you're not sharing with other people. They're private. So we got two kinds of projections. One feed that contains only public information, one that contains both public and private information. And then we got another one that is this magic cookie that you don't give anybody else. You kind of only share with yourself and your closest friends. And that one is a URL where you don't actually have to authenticate yourself. So really hold that one close. But you'll see that visibility projection and also in the calendar event comments. So each calendar event has a bunch of comments to it. So you add /comments and you get the comments feed. And finally, a brand new thing that we've just recently added is the access control list for calendar that you can manage. And again, there's also a projection which allows you to specify the level of detail that you'll find. And I won't go into every detail about how these things work, but just so you understand that these things exist and you can get a lot more data than perhaps you expected the Google Data APIs provide. So some of the URL parameters. So I talked about the base URL, and now there are some URL parameters that you should know. The max results is the maximum number of results you can get if you do a query. That's really useful if you don't want, say if there's a calendar that has tons and tons of events, you only want to get maybe 10 at a time. That'd be a good thing to use. And the nice thing about this is that once you know the common URL parameters, you'll see that applied in all of the Google Data APIs. Alt is another really important one to know, alternate output format that you can use. Atom is kind of the default representation of the data, and RSS is based on RSS 2.0 representation of it, and we also have the JavaScript object notation. And another one, which is JSON and script, which I will show you how to use later on in the talk. And that allows you to use a script tag. And you'll see a lot of calendar-specific URL parameters, like start min and start max, allows you to limit the kind of entries, event entries that you get back. So in this case, you're only getting the calendar events that have started at a certain time range. Pretty simple. And again, there are common XML elements. So you want to talk about the when XML element. It describes the time span. It'll have a start time, and it'll have an end time. So it's a pretty simple way of representing that, and they are all in the GD, the Google Data namespace. So there's also a GD where, which describes a particular location. I gave an example of the relaxant G schema at the bottom, and I'll explain it in a second. But I just wanted to say that there's lots and lots of XML elements that we have defined that we use among the Google services. And again, all of them described online. And there's also, once they're service-specific, Google Calendar has their own GCal namespace, and they define time zone, for example, describes the time zone of your calendar. So if you really want to get the maximum amount of knowledge about exactly how these XML elements are formatted, you want to look at the relaxant G schema that we publish online. And that's helpful to know. The end time, for example, is optional. So an event always has a start time, but might not have an end time. It might have a value string associated with it, and it might have a bunch of reminder XML elements. And you might ask, well, what's a reminder? And you go look at our online docs, and they'll tell you what reminder is, and there can be multiple ones there. So I'll just go, from now on, I just kind of covered everything, kind of high-level overview of GData. I'll go into a specific examples and really show you the code behind them, so you kind of understand, have a hands-on understanding of them, and hopefully, again, answer some of the questions that you might have had about GData. So I'm just adding a calendar event. This is pretty basic. Again, I'm not showing you how to develop a client based on it. I'm just showing you the HTTP protocol and how it works. So I'm making an HTTP request, and I'm pretending there's a user called John, whose email address is john@email.com, and I'm going to post something to their default calendar. And I'll have an entry with a title, Advanced GData Presentation, and John wants to attend this Advanced GData Presentation. And I'm going to put it in the Googleplex. I'm hoping there's a lot of attendees to this event, and I've got a when describing the start time, and this big string describes May 31st at 3:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and then end time at 4:30. And so it's a pretty basic thing. And you'll see the Google service comes back with this, which is almost the same thing, except it added the ID and the updated. So this event ID will really be some long string that uniquely identifies this entry. But I just wrote down event ID in this example. And you'll see an updated tag that shows you what time this entry was put in there. And this is pretty fundamental to a lot of the Google services. And what came back is, strictly speaking, an Atom formatted XML, whereas what I posted originally wasn't, strictly speaking, Atom, because Atom elements have to have an ID tag and an updated tag. So we're pretty flexible on the Google server side to accept data. And it's also important because essentially we'll just ignore and update an ID tag. So that's oftentimes the source of confusion, why it is that we accept something that isn't strictly Atom, but that's OK. How do you modify calendar event? This time I'll use the HTTP put verb. So it looks almost the same, but unfortunately, the room that I got allocated originally just didn't have enough space for all the attendees, so I had to move it to another location, San Jose Convention Center. So I had to change the value string of the where XML. No problem. I just used the put request, and hopefully the server comes back with yes, 200 OK, and everything's the same except for two things. Hopefully two things. The value string got changed to San Jose Convention Center, and the updated time is newer. Right. Earlier was 12 p.m. and now it's 1 p.m. So very simple way of working with elements, and everything's kind of built that way. And finally, I want to delete the calendar event. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but let's just say you did. So you use the same ID as was in the entry ID. And the HTTP response is 200 OK, and it shows you the current content of the feed. And for the most part, all the Google services work this way. There are exceptions. This is the basic concept. And then when there are exceptions, there's good reasons why. So I think earlier in talk, somebody mentioned that they wanted the ability to delete a row from the spreadsheets. And we've decided that instead of literally deleting a row when you have a delete request, we'll actually clear the row. And there was good reasons for doing that, and that's open to discussion. But the bottom line is you want to look at the specification, see what it actually does. It's good to understand it. So I'll go into another example here. This is very closely related. And this is I'll actually show you a real working sample. So the idea behind this, I'm going to present the JavaScript object notation, and I'll also present how you get a whole calendar. So in this case, I'm looking at the developer calendar that we publish. It's a public calendar. Anyone can see it. And I'm going to order the results by the start time. And I'm going to filter. I'm only going to show elements, entries that have a start time at least May 1st, and those that have a maximum start time of June 1st. So basically, I'm going to show you everything in May. So if I put this into my browser, which I probably could, I'm going to show you an example of it, but I won't right now. I'll show you in a second. It'll come back with a long XML document, and it will be totally unreadable, so probably no point in presenting to you right now. But so I just stripped out most of the extra XML that I don't need for this particular presentation. I show you here the title, dev events, and an ID, which is some complicated ID. And this particular element is the Google Developer Day. Oh, that's interesting. I should attend that one. So that's May 31st. And hopefully, oh yes, it has a where location, but this one says worldwide because we're actually in lots of different locations. OK, great. So that seems like a useful feed. Why don't I make a little JavaScript example out of it? So I put a bunch of HTML, and I think this would be a much cleaner, much better presentation if I had used the Google Mashup editor. But for now, we'll just stick to HTML and JavaScript. The old-fashioned way. And I've got an HTML tag, I've got a title in there, I've got a div with an ID of agenda, and I've got a script tag, which has almost the same URL, except I added to it alt equals JSON in script. This is what you normally use when you use a script tag, and I define the callback function to use. So what's going to happen is when it loads this page, it will find the script tag and start to load the contents. And it will see this URL, and it'll come back and say, OK, now I'm going to call this function called insert agenda, and I'm going to pass that function the contents of the feed. And instead of passing it XML, which is a little bit harder to manage in JavaScript, I'm going to pass it instead something that is more naturally suited for JavaScript. But I'm missing the insert agenda function, so let's write that real quick. OK, that was easy. So this function insert agenda, it takes a root as a parameter, and that root will have a feed as at the top level. So I assign that to the feed variable, and then underneath feed there'll be entry. So I assign that to a variable, and that's really an array of entries. OK, and I create this HTML array, and I'll just iterate over all the entries in the feed. And I can grab the title from the entry. I can grab the start time that will let me know the day. And I can just construct some HTML out of it and assign it to the inner HTML of the agenda property. So now let's run this thing, and aha, it worked. Look at that. Google Developer Events in May 2007, and it shows you the date and the name of the developer event. OK, so if you don't believe me that this works, let's go to the browser and run it. Aha, it works. OK, this is the most boring demo you've ever seen, probably. But, and I'll just, OK. And let's look at the code behind it. View page source. Right, so this is exactly the same thing that I showed you in the slide. And you'll see a more involved example on code.google.com/GData. It's exactly the same demo, except it's a little bit prettier than what I showed you. But I just wanted to show you how simple it is to extract the data. So in the final part of the talk, I'll talk about a couple of authentication mechanisms, client login and auth-sub. This is probably more detail than you need to know in general. But it's good to understand how it works underneath. Google client login just means that the user has to enter the username and password to install a desktop application. So what comes back when the desktop application contacts google.com is an authentication token. So instead of always passing in the username and password into the Google service, it's always using this authentication token instead. And that identifies which user is using. So for example, Google Calendar can use that to say, OK, I know that you're actually allowed to access this Google Calendar, so I'm going to give you access to it. So client login is simpler than auth-sub, but it has a disadvantage, obviously, that the user has to give the application the username and password. So here's an example. It's very similar to the example that Jeff showed you earlier today. You send a post request to google.com/accounts/client-login. And you give it the email, the username, password, the service name. In this case, it's Google Calendar, so it uses CL, and there's a bunch of there's a different code for each of the Google services. And I specify that I am the ABCD company, and I have the ABCD application. OK, so the server response is, yes, that's the right username and password. And at the very bottom, it'll do auth equals, and it'll give you some long string, and that's your token. So ignore the other two. That's a short story. And OK, so I'm all set. So now every time that I want to make a GData request, it's not going to be a URL parameter. It's going to be an HTTP header. I'm going to say authorization, Google login. That's the client login authorization. And the auth token is exactly the same thing from the previous slide. And you can do the same thing in Java code. Just to give an example, that works. I create a new calendar service. I tell it I'm an ABCD company and I'm an ABCD application. And I set the user credentials to be my user at gmail.com, and here's my password. So pretty simple. So auth authentication has a few more steps to make that work. The web application is on the left, and on the very end is the user. And in the middle is the Google Accounts authentication and the Google service you're trying to access. So the web application never actually sees the user's username and password. It instead redirects to google.com. And when it does the redirect, it tells it, when you're done, come back to me at this URL. And I'll show you how that works in a little bit more detail. And if the user says, yeah, that's fine, I want that application to access my data, then it'll be redirected back to the web application with a token. And not surprisingly, you use that token every time that you do a GData request. So it's slightly different interpretation. So I'm going to give you an example here of an unregistered web application. This will be slightly different if you register your application. I won't go into details about why or how. But I'm the abcd.com website, and I'm going to request a one-time use token. And I'm going to exchange it later for a session token. So when the user logs into my website, abcd.com, I'll redirect to that URL. And it'll be google.com/account/auth-sub-request. And I'll tell it, well, go back to abc.com/abcdapp.html. So when you're done, redirecting back to me. And then I can say, well, what I'm trying to access is the calendar feed. So I'm telling the user what I'm trying to access. So user when the user is accepting it, is accepting only to allow that particular feed to be accessed. And I'm going to say that that I'm going to eventually be requesting a session token. So this is what the user will see. This is the web page might look like. abc.com, it hasn't been registered, so you see that yellow section. And as a user, I can just click on grant access, and let's see what happens. I'm redirected back to abc.com/abcdapp.html. It's exactly what the application requested. But it's also got a token in there that I can use one time. And with that token, I can just go back to the website, can now go back to google.com and say, all right, I just got this token. I'd really like to be able to have a whole session with the user, so please give me a session token. So I'll go back to google.com/accounts/auth-sub-session token, and I'll say in authorization that here's the token that you just gave me. And the HTTP response is pretty simple. It's basically got the token that you can now use for real to actually have a whole session with the user, and you provided some great functionality. So every time that the website wants to do a GData request, it'll put this authorization header. The difference is now I'll use auth-sub, and I'll use this auth token. So in Java code, basically looks like this. Instead of set user credentials, I'll do now set auth-sub token with some token variable that I might have gotten in the previous request. And there's a lot more things you can do with auth-sub. This is just the basic working. So I encourage you to go back to, again, google.com, code.google.com/API/GData. You'll get a lot more information, a lot more things you can do with these, a lot more Google services that you can access. You probably want to, if you have any questions when you try to use it, you want to give us feedback. You want to go to the website, the Google groups, the place where we are able to see your feedback and feature requests and reporting bugs. I know you'll often encounter things that you wanted to see, and that's a good place to put it. And that's where we know what the developers are looking for. And finally, I just want to end on a positive note that you want to see innovation. Google is totally standing behind these data APIs. We want to do creative things with the data. That's why we give you the ability to write applications that use that data and solve unmet needs, whether it kind of solves everybody's needs or just a particular group that you're targeting. That's a great way to use GData. And sometimes the simplest applications can be the most powerful. All right, so I'm going to see if there are any questions. And I'd ask that if you are interested in asking questions, please go over to microphones.
I have a question about the authorization stuff. It looks like all the authorization is based on the Google accounts, which is basically a Microsoft Passport thing, right? You expect 6 billion guys on Earth to have Google accounts and use them for everything. Am I right assuming that, or are you guys planning to become more open and support OpenID or any other kind of identity meta systems?
Okay. So the question was, we use auth-sub and client login, but there are other ways of authenticating, like OpenID. I think we got the same question actually in the first talk, and it's a very good question. And we can go back and look at those. I can't talk about anything in the future, of course, but our plan is to as much as possible to submit what we do to open standards as well. But
Right. So right now there are no specific plans for opening that up. You might in the future, but nothing specific.
I wouldn't talk about the future.
Is there any plan to get cross-domain files posted so that ActionScript programmers can access your APIs?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm not actually sure. I'll definitely take that request. And yes? OK, I've been told yes by other engineering members of my team.
All right, so earlier somebody asked in my talk actually about delete on the spreadsheets, and it came up again in this talk. So I misspoke earlier when I said I thought that it would just clear the row. It actually, if you're in the list feed and you do an HTTP delete on that particular row, it actually does remove the row and shift the other rows up. So I just wanted to correct that, and yeah, I tested it out right over there. So
great, thank you.
That's good. All right, thanks.
I have a couple of quick questions. Is it possible to associate multiple scopes for a single auth session token?
I think the answer is no.
Okay, and
again, that's something we can take back as a feature request.
It's probably not that big a deal, but the other question is, what do you plan on doing with the granularity of the scope? For instance, are there any plans on having access list control type things based on the scope? For instance, for a particular resource, you grant reads to a user but not writes.
I'm not sure the answer to your question, but can you repeat your question again? I want to make sure I understood.
So in the scope specification, when you're asked for your service, is it possible to grant particular access to that resource? Right now, you ask for a token with a particular scope, and you have write access. Is there any plans in the future where a single resource can be, where you can only modify it or write to it or read from it and so forth?
OK, if I understand your question correctly, you're asking if, right now, I'm specifying I want write access to Google Calendar. But let's say the application only wants specific access to a particular piece of data.
If you wish to grant only read access,
for the user point of view rather than the website?
Right.
OK, I don't think there is something like that today. Again, I can look at that as a feature request.
Thanks.
I appreciate that feedback.
Good afternoon. So the hacker in me really likes the move towards REST-y type stuff, where you can actually kind of guess a lot of times, hey, this might work, or you see it in one app, and then you try it in Calendar and it works, or and likewise, the move away from, or at least the support for JSON instead of XML. I can parse JSON really quickly with my own eyes, and XML is really wordy and a lot of times confusing to me. Is that a trend towards that? Are you going to see that across more types of things as the developer community and other people using the API? Is there pushback? They don't like that. They want, soapy stuff. Can you just comment on why the motivation towards REST and JSON support? OK, so the question is why the motivation towards REST and how the developer community is accepting that. And from everything that I see, it's been very positive. And there's some quotes about how excited people are about it. But I think, generally speaking, absolutely. I mean, it's based on the Atom format. This is something that in RSS people can build applications on it. And, certainly, my impression is it's been very positive. And why REST over SOAP? It's just made it much easier for us to move quickly and publish these APIs and just export the data that Google has. And we found it to be very, very successful. Google does have SOAP-based APIs, I believe. Oh, yes.
Yeah, right. So
AdWords.
Right, exactly.
And yeah, and as a follow-up, what took it so long? I mean, JSON has been around for a long time, and REST, has been around. I mean, SOAP, you had to make it up. REST was kind of there from the beginning. Yeah, right. So that's a good question, and that we provide JSON because we think that JavaScript developers are going to absolutely demand it now. Okay, thank you.
Hi, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about Google's approach to change management with regard to the GData APIs. So right now, as far as I know, at least the ones that we use aren't versioned, and the behavior of some of those APIs can change without notification to the developers, or at least not previous notification. And I wonder if there's any thought or plan to, create sandbox servers for new versions and actual, versioning of the APIs and some advanced notice of new or changed functionality before it goes live.
Okay. So the question, I think there are kind of two parts of that question, and one is the fear that Google might change the functionality from the way it works right now, and so is there some plans to kind of provide a particular working API that you can be guaranteed will always stay working, and as we develop new versions that you can choose to develop against the old API or work against the new API. And as, of course, part of the answer is going to be as much as possible. We don't want to have to ever get to that. Ideally, everything will just continue to work the way it is, and as we add more features, we're just going to be additions to what's already in there, ideally. As for versioning, there are Google APIs that do have versioning. I don't think GData does anything like that right now, and this is something we can certainly consider if there's enough developer demand for it. We definitely are committed to making sure the developer community is happy and satisfied moving forward. I mean, we'll definitely, even if something like that did happen, we would definitely want to be working with them. But as far as advanced notice of upcoming changes, that's something we're going to have to, in general, we cannot publish features, but to the extent where we can, something like that could happen, sure.
So is the GData API a single API across all these applications? Will like 3 of these apps update their methods and stuff separately from the other 7 apps? And then also element names across the different apps. Will like time be time across like the Picasa, the calendar, and stuff like that? Will the Picasa have like picture taken time and then other stuff like that? Is there going to be any synchronization across the board so we don't have to learn 12 different ways to name a particular element? Okay,
so the question is, are we going to have kind of a proliferation of different names for the same thing across the Google services? And to the extent that Google APIs are built on GData, we definitely strongly work towards making sure that they're all using the same standard elements, and not just the ones that Google has developed. I mentioned GD1 for specifying a time span, and as much as possible, we want to fix the use of that of GD1 for that particular purpose. But there's also OpenSearch is a great example of a place where we took an existing standard that wasn't developed by Google for specifying the number of items in results in a feed. And we always try to reuse them as much as possible. We've, in some places, kind of gone out of our way just to make sure that we're reusing existing things. Are there going to be examples where slightly different things were done in slightly different places? Potentially, and that's part of innovation. That's part of allowing kind of Google services to as much as possible go in their own direction in terms of providing the functionality that developers are demanding. But certainly, as a design standard, we're trying very much as possible to reuse existing elements.
I've got an unrelated question to my earlier one.
Sure.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about security. So in this morning's session, and in yours as well, you talked about authentication and the initial authentication exchange being done securely over an encrypted connection, but then subsequent calls being done over just plain HTTP in the clear, and so you're sending data back and forth in the clear. Is that, so it seems like there may be a security issue around that. Can you speak to that?
Okay, that's a good question. There's some concerns about the authentication schemes using very easy ways of plain text and using ways that are very easy to grab the user's username and password. And, if I understand your question correctly, and do I have some comments about that? Unfortunately, I don't really have a good comment to that because I'm not very knowledgeable myself about the security issues behind it. But I can maybe redirect you to someone who can give you a much better answer than me. So if I don't have any more questions, I'd like to thank you for attending and enjoy the rest of the day.